Hey guys, my name is Gabby, welcome back to my channel, and today I'm going to be filming my November wrap-up. In the month of November, I read a total of 11 books. I really started getting into modern poetry this month, and so I read a lot of poetry books. So I think I'm going to talk about all the full-length novels I read first, and then I'm going to talk about all the poetry books at the end because there are a few of them. I read 7 regular novels and 4 poetry novels, so I wanted to divide it this way just so I could talk about all the poetry at once. And another awesome thing is that this month I finally reached my goal of reading 100 books in the year of 2017, and now I have read 105 books, so I'm really excited about that because I've never actually finished 100 books in a year, and last year I was complaining about how I only managed to read 99 books, and I was really pissed because I wanted to reach 100, so woo! I'm at 105 now. Yeah. Let's just jump right into it. Small doses, loving you, it's explosive, you know this. The first book that I read this month, Artemis by Weir. This is one of Book of the Month's November selections, and this book follows this criminal named Jazz who lives on the moon. Artemis is the only city on the moon. She's originally from Saudi Arabia, and then she moved to the moon when she was 6 years old. She works as a criminal, she brings in illegal products on the moon. But now she gets involved in this crime that could potentially get her exiled to Earth, and it puts her entire city in jeopardy, and that's the main event that this story is revolving around. Love any story that takes place in outer space. I think it's just so much fun. Sci-fi, an adult sci-fi book isn't really my typical genre, but I love The Martian so much. The fact that this entire book takes place on the moon was really cool to me. I loved learning all the world building facts about the moon that he talked about, and how their city came to be, and all the rules of the city on the moon. And the main problem I had with this book was with Jazz as a main character. She just felt like a copy and paste of Mark Watney from The Martian, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but Mark Watney's humor, it kind of read like teenage boy comedy, and it just didn't really work in this case. You could really feel this was written by a male author, and I find it really uncomfortable when you read books from a female's point of view, but you can really tell that it was written by a guy. I don't know how to explain how that feels. It's just when you read it, you just kind of know. Not to mention the stakes in this one just didn't feel as high as The Martian, because The Martian is a survival story, so the stakes constantly felt really high, but in this one the stakes never felt quite as high as The Martian. I ended up giving this one 3 out of 5 stars. I didn't enjoy this one as much as The Martian. The second book I read this month was After We Fall by Melanie, Harlow. This is a new adult romance that follows the characters Jack and Margot. I read this one because I loved her book From This Moment that I read last month, I believe. Jack and Margot were side characters in that book, and so I didn't realize there were other characters in other books, so I wanted to read this one because I really adored their characters in that book, and this is their origin story of how they got together and stuff. Jack is this guy who owns this ranch, and he was in the military, and now he's come back from the military, and he lost his wife, and now he's just completely entirely focused on owning this ranch and getting his life together, and he owns the ranch with 2 of his brothers. And then Margot is this publicist who says she's gonna help them to promote the ranch so that they can get more people interested and they can get more money. Jack is completely against it because he's I don't need a publicist. So there's a lot of tension in this one. Unfortunately though, this one ended up being a really lame, ridiculous, cliche bullshit romance. One of those typical cliche new adult stories where you kind of know immediately where it's going to go, and the romance doesn't really bring anything new to the table, and both of the main characters kind of act like immature children. It was so bad. I don't know, I was just so disappointed by this one. I ended up giving it 2 out of 5 stars. It was not my jam. The third book I read this month was The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue by Mackenzie. I've been recommended this book freaking crazy, guys, for the past few months. Everybody's been you need to read this book, so I finally read it, and this is a young adult historical fiction male-male romance that takes place in the 1700s. It follows Monty and Percy as they're best friends, and we get to follow them on this adventure through Barcelona and Paris, all across Europe, basically. This book involves so many awesome things adventure, action, feminism, interracial relationships, and LGBT relationships. The romance between Monty and Percy in this is such a slow build, beautiful romance as they go from best friends to lovers, and it's so controversial because this is a 1700s. Male-male relationships were almost unheard of at this point, and the idea of feminism was very not common at this time. That's why I think it was extra powerful in that way, because it was so unheard of at that time. Monty just has this personality. He's just so charming and cocky, and he just has this confidence about him that I really enjoyed, and I loved how Percy was like the complete opposite of him in that way, because Percy was more sensitive and thoughtful, and I was kind of hesitant going into it because I don't read a lot of historical fiction and it's really like not my genre, but the way this was written was really like charming and so unique, and I don't think I've ever read anything like this before. The old-fashionedness of it kind of made me like it even more. Like, the way it was written, it was very like old school and charming, but like I really liked it. I was so surprised by how much I liked it. It was really fun. So I ended up giving this one 4 out of 5 stars. The fourth book I read this month was The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. This is another one that's been recommended to me non-stop throughout the year. I listened to the audiobook for this one and it was fantastic. So this book follows this young girl named Star Carter, and she witnesses her best friend Khalil getting murdered by the police when he didn't do anything wrong. This book is just really important, and I think it's a really real representation of what is happening in America right now. This book is just so fucking relevant to our times right now, and when people read this, it'll open their eyes to the prejudice that exists in the country and the white privilege that exists in our country. Aside from the amazing political message that this book has to send, it also does have a really incredibly beautiful story about Star and her family and her coming of age story after this happens to her, because she's obviously traumatized by this event. And really loved Star's family. I loved her parents. Like, the relationship that her parents had is so cute, and she talks about how her parents are her own OTP. Star's complicated relationships with her friends and her classmates, and the way like these people can be very subtly racist and not even realize that they're doing it. And I just think that this is something everyone should be reading. I mean, this is a book that is inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement. That part really got to me when she was talking about how when you're born black, you have to have 2 different important conversations with your parents, not just the birds and the bees talk like all kids, but you also have to have the talk about what to do if you're ever stopped by a police officer. And like, that just really like struck a chord with me. Like, why should that be something that's as important as the birds and the bees conversation, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know, everything about this book really got to me. It was a really emotional read. Even as an audiobook, I was like, oh my god, like, and the way her parents, even after the event, still get like harassed by the police, and it's just so terrible. And I think it's so terrible and emotional because it's real, and this is happening every day in America, and really fucking sad. So I ended up giving this one 5 out of 5 stars. It was fucking great. It was so good. The 5th book I read this month was Dear Bridget, I Want You. This is a new adult romance that follows this couple named Simon and Bridget. Simon is a doctor and she's a nurse. They meet in the emergency room on this like really funny, weird thing. She's basically looking for a new roommate, and so Simon moves in, and she like doesn't know it's him really before she accepts the offer, kind of, and so she's kind of surprised when it's like the guy from the emergency room. Bridget has an 8-year-old son, and her husband died a few years ago. Unfortunately, this romance ends up having a lot of like cliches, and it's pretty cheesy at times. Like, at some parts their chemistry was so on point and I was like shipping it so hard, and then at other times it would just end up being kind of like cheesy and like forgettable. I think my favorite part is like the relationship that forms between Simon and her son, because it was just really adorable. I ended up giving it 3 out of 5 stars. Like, at the end of the day, it was kind of a forgettable romance, at least when it comes to like the romance that I like to read. So the 6th book that I read this month was The Summer That Melted Everything by Tiffany McDaniel. Thank you to Tiffany McDaniel for sending me a copy of this for review. So this story follows this guy named Fielding Bliss, and he is in his 80s now, but he's like reflecting on the summer of 1984 when he was only 13 years old, when his dad, Autopsy Bliss, sent an invitation to the devil inviting him to the town. The devil comes to the town in the form of this black 13-year-old boy named Sal, and he claims to be the devil, and of course like nobody really believes him, but then all this weird shit starts happening in the town that makes them think maybe he's right, and he brings along with him this like heat wave that's like the hottest summer they've ever experienced. I think that this book has a lot to say about sin and prejudice and racism and homophobia and the idea of like blaming all of your problems on the devil a lot. of topics to cover in one book, but I do think that this book has the potential to become a classic. Like, a lot of people are comparing this book to To Kill a Mockingbird, and I would definitely understand that comparison. The writing is so dense and heavy, and I don't really know how to describe it, but it is literary fiction, so it's one of those books that's like, it reads like a classic. It's kind of hard to read because language is just very like difficult and unusual at times, and because of that I personally had a hard time getting through this book, and I didn't really connect with any of the characters, but I think that this is a situation where it's like, it's not you, it's definitely me. Like, this book is probably gonna go on to become a classic, and it's really fucking important. I just personally, this just isn't the book for me, you know? I ended up giving this one 3 out of 5 stars. It was alright. The last novel that I read that I want to talk about before I jump into the poetry section of this is Her Every Fear by Peter Swanson. This is an adult thriller that follows this woman named Kate who lives in London, but she swaps apartments with her second cousin in Boston, who she's never met. So, cousin's name is Corbin, and he's living in Boston, but he gets a job transfer to London for 6 months. So he reaches out to her, and he's like, hey, do you want to swap apartments for 6 months? Because I need a place to stay in London, and I could save a lot of money if I just stayed at your place, and you can come and stay in Boston and experience America for 6 months, because she's never left the country. She swaps places with him, and she moves into Boston. On the very first night that she is in her apartment, police discover a woman murdered in the apartment next door. And so immediately, obviously, Corbin is a suspect because he lived next door to her and he just like happened to take off that night. This book was so fucking good. I love Peter Swanson's other book, The Kind Worth Killing. It's definitely one of my new favorite thrillers. The premise that it gives you on Goodreads, which is basically what I just told you, gives away nothing. Like, this book is really, like, there's so many plot twists, it's so unexpected where this story goes, and it's so sick and fucked up, and like all these characters are so weird and fucked up, and in like the best way though, you know? I also like annotated the hell out of this book while I read it, which I really like love doing. Like, I just wrote a lot of my like predictions in the like spaces. Every time I like wrote my predictions, I was always wrong. Love the way that Peter Swanson is able to change point of views so subtly and so frequently, and I couldn't put this book down. I was so addicted to it. I should have finished it in one sitting, but I had something going on, so I had to split it into 2 sittings. Like, when I wasn't reading this book, I was thinking about it and I was like, what is going on? I have to finish it. I have to know. It's been a long time since I've read a book that was such a page turner the way this one was. I was just so invested in the story. I ended up giving this one 4.5 out of 5 stars. And now to jump into the poetry books that I read this month. The first one that I read is Love Her Wild by Atticus, and this is a poetry collection that's divided into 3 sections: Love, Her, and Wild. Some really gorgeous like black and white photography throughout the book. Like, all the pictures throughout the book are black and white. That one is probably like my favorite. This book is so easy to read. It's really short. None of the poems are particularly long. I don't know, I just felt really like inspired after reading this. Like, I loved it. I really like loved it. And of course, like, some poems were really like cheesy, you know, but most of them I really like beautiful, you know. Here's an example of some of the poems that I really loved. She was afraid of heights, but she was much more afraid of never flying. Depression is being colorblind and constantly being told how colorful the world is. Love is diving headfirst into someone else's confusion and finding that it all makes sense. I woke up from the daydream of my 20s in a cold sweat, anxious for all the lives I hadn't lived. And that's just a few examples of some of the poems that I really enjoyed in this one. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. It's one of my favorites. I loved it. Alright, the next poetry book I read was Milk and Honey by Rupi Kaur, one of the most popular books. This is a really gorgeous poetry collection, and you can definitely tell that this set of poems is very personal to the author, and in a way it kind of reads like a diary because it feels so personal. Many of the poems revolve around love, regret, fear, rape, loss, feminism, and grief. These poems are divided into 4 sections, and it's divided into the hurting, the loving, the breaking, and the healing. I really loved the feminist poems in this book. Those were like easily my favorite ones, but I ended up rating this one a little bit lower because some of the poems just felt very like uninspired and basic and just kind of like simplistic to the point where they just kind of read like random sentences and they didn't really like stand on their own. But one of my favorite poems from this is when she says, "Our backs tell stories no books have the spine to carry." Really loved that one, but I ended up giving this one 3.5 to 5 stars. The next one I read is The Sun and Her Flower Flowers by Rupi Kaur, and this is the same author as Milk and Honey. It's her new book, and I actually enjoy this one a lot more than Milk and Honey. This book is divided into 5 sections. It's wilting, falling, rooting, rising, and blooming. Poems mainly revolve around grief, self-love, self-hate, rape, immigration, feminism, depression, and empowerment. My favorite poems in this collection were the longer poems that had these like thin black boxes surrounding them, and the titles were like Home and The Art of Growing. Those were my 2 favorites. And there's just so many beautiful poems about immigration and feminism, and you can really tell that she like loves and respects her parents so much for taking the chance to like move to America. Like some of my favorites, like one of the feminist ones was, I can't wrap my head around the fact that I have to convince half the world's population my body is not their bed. I am busy learning the consequences of womanhood when I should be learning science and math instead. Fucking love that. There's this other one that just really like gave me chills, and it says, there are mountains growing beneath our feet that cannot be contained. All we've endured has prepared us for this. Bring your hammers and fists, we have a glass ceiling to shatter. I love it. I was so inspired and so moved by the feminist poems and by the immigration poems. Really loved, and I was really moved, and I ended up giving this one 4 out of 5 stars. I thought it was great. The last poetry novel that I read this month was The Princess Saves Herself in This One by Amanda Lovelace, and I really like loved this collection. It was also divided into 4 parts: the princess, the damsel, the queen, and you. I loved poems about fiction and reading and like the power of words. Gave me goosebumps reading those because I could relate to them so hard. I love how this kind of like reads like a story, very personal to the author as she experiences death in her family. I loved the poems about sisterhood and about death and about falling in love again. It was all worded in such beautiful ways, and it was very lyrical. The only reason why I knocked off a star is because since this does read like a story, some of the poems can't really stand on their own, and some of my favorite poems from this one are: fiction, the ocean I dive headfirst into when I can no longer breathe in reality. When I had no friends, I reached into my beloved books and sculpted some out of 12-point Times New Roman. When I die, do not waste a minute mourning me. I may go, but I will leave behind all my 1,001 lives. A book-mad girl never dies. That last one kind of like made me emotional, like not gonna lie. But yeah, I ended up giving that one 4 out of 5 stars, and I really enjoyed that one as well. Those are all of the books that I read this month. How many books did you guys read this month, and what was your favorite and least favorite books of the month? I think my favorite books of the month by far were like The Hate You Give and Her Every Fear by Peter Swanson. This month was really fucking great because not only because Taylor Swift finally released her 6th album Reputation at the beginning of the month, and I've just been listening to it nonstop and I fucking love it. I finally caught up with Shameless on Netflix. I've been like binge watching it for like months now, and I finally finished season 7 on Netflix, and I'm just obsessed. I love it. And also because 2 of my favorite actors, Jake Gyllenhaal and Margot Robbie, just did an Actors on Actors interview and a photo shoot, and it was just so amazing to see them like talking and interacting because I've wanted them to star in a movie together for like forever, and just seeing them talk together for 30 minutes was like the greatest thing of my life, so I was really excited about that. Well, and this month it was really cool because I finally started reading more poetry again, and poetry is something that I used to like really love when I was in middle school. I'm finally starting to like dive into like loving poetry again, and I really love that. Next month I'm really excited to start posting my favorite and least favorite books of the year videos. Those are always really fun for me to do, and I think I am gonna upload my favorite movies from 2017 video too, because I love movies almost as much as I love books, and I still need to see a couple more movies before I decide that final list. But thank you guys so much for watching as always, and I will see you guys next time. Basically because her husband's name is... oh my god. Husband? Did I just say husband?